Chapter 9. The Outside. Tsumugi's theory went like this. The team that put them into the Near World program was a pretty powerful group of people who wanted to see more of what she called Danganronpa, otherwise referred to as the Killing Games. Right now, there was no telling if anything they knew was fictional or not. But one thing was for certain. The tragedy did happen, and Tsumugi did not orchestrate the killing game. Instead, she had begrudgingly assumed that the role was pushed onto her from the very start, and the flashback lights only reinforced that, At the same time, they further painted a false narrative for everybody, including herself. According to the story the team placed in her head, everyone agreed to the killing game prior, but she didn't know whether or not that was truly the case. As it turned out, Shuichi was right. Tsumugi did end up being angry at the team, if not angrier than anyone else. Granted, she said she was only mad because that meant that her beloved TV show didn't exist, but Kokichi would take what he could get. Now that the killing game had pretty much stopped entirely, no one knew what to do. They had as much as the picture as they could get now, and that was that. The only way he knew to leave the simulation was to break the end wall, but...
"I'm still not sure where Shuichi found that bomb,"
Tsumugi had admitted when he brought it up.
"I didn't even know we had bombs at the Ark."
"They won't have a spare set of gloves, but they'll have explosives."
Himiko sighed at the time.
"This place really is a death academy."
On that cheerful note, Kaito suggested something else. Why don't they look for the hole Shuichi already made in the end wall? It couldn't be that hard to find. All they'd have to do was circle the perimeter of the end wall, and eventually they'd stumble across it. K1B0 pointed out that this was exactly what Shuichi had asked them not to do. Kaito argued that Shuichi wasn't in his right mind, and that he might need their help. For once, Kokichi agreed with him. Shuichi had even confessed that he was worried about what dying continuously would do to his brain. There was no way he was thinking clearly. Well, believe it or not, they did find the place Shuichi used the bomb. It was far behind Tenko's ultimate research lab, completely out of sight from anyone who wasn't looking for it. The ground around the affected area was very burnt, clumps of dirt having been uprooted and sprayed everywhere from the initial blast. There was just one tiny problem.
"Huh? Wasn't there supposed to be a hole here?"
Kaito asked, feeling and pressing against the end wall with his hands.
"Do you think the bomb didn't work?"
Himiko wondered.
"Or maybe breaking the end wall is impossible."
"It shouldn't be,"
Tsumugi imputed. She was standing close to Maki, who had offered to keep an eye on the mastermind to make sure she didn't get up to any funny business.
"After all, Shuichi managed to get out, didn't he?"
"He likely would have shown himself by now if he hadn't," K1B0 agreed in a murmur. "At least, I assume he would. His actions are difficult to predict when I haven't seen this changed version of him." Changed version of him. Kokichi couldn't help but frown at that. It wasn't Shuichi's fault he got stuck in a time loop. It was technically Kokichi's, for setting off that electro bomb in the first place.
"Aha!"
Kokichi snapped his fingers and turned to K1B0.
"I know. Key Boy, how about you run into that wall as hard as you possibly can?"
Why on earth would I do that?"
K1B0 demanded in alarm.
"'Cause the impact will make all of your robot parts explode, and you'll blast a hole right in the side of the end wall,"
Kokichi exclaimed, as if this were common sense. K1B0 blanched, looking horrified.
"What are you suggesting I do?"
"Quit fighting." Maki snapped at the two of them. "I think I know why there's no hole."
"Yeah, You do?
asked Himiko. Kaito grinned, shooting a thumbs up in her direction. That's my Maki roll. Go ahead and tell him. The nickname made Maki scowl even deeper, and she fiddled with her bow to avoid looking at the astronaut. Ah, idiots in love. Kokichi was stunned that Kaito had survived this killing game for so long.
In his note, Shuichi refers to the announcement as trigger resets.
Maki explained.
Those only started because the simulation couldn't function without Monokuma knowing the culprit. Right? It tried to correct itself.
Ah, I get it,
Tsumugi hummed.
The morning announcement had to have fixed the wall.
Maki didn't look too happy about Tsumugi contributing to the conversation in such a casual manner. She replied with a simple, yeah, and left it at that. But if leaving the bounds of the map, as he called it, is how you exit the simulation, why would the simulation need to fix that? K1B0 wondered, with an inquisitive look down at the scorched dirt. The survivors of the killing game would have to leave the simulation eventually. Exactly, Kokichi said. He placed his hands behind his head, leaning back on his heels. Survivors! Shuichi left alone. The simulation probably didn't like that. That probably means we shouldn't blow up the wall again, considering the simulation is already pretty broken.
How were we supposed to know to leave through the end wall anyway?
Himiko grumped, her shoulders slouched. She must be taking all of this pretty hard, Kokichi thought.
Everyone who did survive, there's no way we would have known to blow up the end wall.
Maybe Team Danganronpa was going to let us out,
Tsumugi mused idly.
Let you out. Anyway, the mastermind is always executed at the end. That's the one part I wasn't really looking forward to.
No one cares about your mastermind angst. Kokichi wanted to snap at her. He didn't. He really wasn't in the mood to fight at the moment. All he could think about was Shuichi. What could he possibly have been thinking? Kokichi couldn't imagine having to remember dying over and over, stuck in a time loop where his only chance of escape was far out of reach. The only reason Shuichi even tried after everything was because of a 1-in-a-million chance appearing on Jabberwock Island. Kokichi wondered, was Shuichi afraid through it all? Angry because he had the misfortune of remembering it? Relieved with the chance of saving his friends? He had to have been happy about being given a second chance to save Kaito, even if he wasn't sure who was under the hydraulic press at first. It was hard to know. Shuichi had lived through weeks in just one repeating night. He had changed because of that time. Memories forever lost on everyone else. They would never truly know how hard Shuichi tried to save them. He was pushed far enough to murder someone. Awkward, sweet, lovable Shuichi, slitting someone's throat in a last, fleeting attempt to stop his own torment. Whether Shuichi was right about the act of rapidly dying and being rejuvenated having effects on someone's brain or not, there was one simple truth to the matter. Dying changes you as a person. Coming back from the most permanent thing in the world isn't something most people can just brush off. Shuichi must know that, right? So what do we do? K1B0's question drew Kokichi out of his troubled thoughts. Should we search for another explosive? Nah, Kokichi's right. Messing with the simulation any more might get us hurt. Kaito sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. And I'll be honest, I'm running on fumes here. Maki's eyes flashed with alarm, and she flinched forward, looking torn between staying close to Tsumugi and making sure Kaito didn't kneel over. You mean your health? K1B0 guessed worriedly.
Hey, Tsumugi, did you do that?
Himiko asked the mastermind.
Did you make Kaito sick?
Ooh, That was something Kokichi had been wondering about. He could tell Samugi wasn't expecting to be asked this either, because she blinked at the mage with her creepy blue eyes in surprise.
It was supposed to be a driving point to push the plague narrative,
Samugi explained once she recovered.
There's not really a cure for it. Leaving the simulation is his best bet, I think.
Maki looked just about ready to shatter the end wall with her bare hands. Leaving the simulation will cure him? Hey, I'm not dying or anything, Kaito interjected hurriedly. Unless things get drastic, I don't want to make any more of these trigger resets or whatever to happen. It'd be trouble if we reset the time loop, K1B0 agreed, a little slowly. But, Kaito, for your health, and to help Shuichi? Kaito clenched his jaw and looked away from the robot, balling his hand into a fist. I want to help Shuichi. Don't get me wrong. He needs help, whether that Team Danganronpa is there or not. He's gonna get himself hurt if he keeps going like this. But
you can't go on much further, Maki finished for him, and you don't want to take any risks if you can't handle them yourself.
At that, Kaito was quiet, and that's honestly what Kokichi had been suspecting from the start. Well, if they weren't breaking out of here because Kaito was afraid of a little risk, then fine. Kokichi could work with that. He was ignoring the relief he felt deep in his chest. Even if he didn't remember it, he didn't want the time loop to start again. The thought of dying over and over was terrifying to him. And Kokichi wasn't scared of much. Shuichi said the time loop restarted at night, Kokichi recalled. So, let's round up back in the courtyard after the nighttime announcement. If we all haven't been blasted back into the time loop, we can figure out what to do from there without worrying about those dumb trigger resets. Okay?
But what if something happens?
Himiko shot a nervous look at Tsumugi.
What if...
I'm not gonna do anything, Tsumugi interrupted her. There's no point. I love the killing games with all my heart and soul. But if Team Danganronpa abandoned the project like Shuichi speculated they did, then I don't see any reason to try.
Even so, I'm gonna keep an eye on you,
Himiko declared with a sudden burst of determination.
I have to make sure nothing else crazy happens, 'cause I'm already way too confused.
Tsumugi stared at her. That's fine by me, I guess. I'm gonna go to my lab and work. Even if it's not real, it's how I relieve stress, you know?
I'm gonna go rest, Kaito decided. I've got to get pumped up for tonight, and it'll be nice lying in a real bed again.
What a way to subtly jab at Kokichi. At least, it gave him the perfect opportunity to remove himself from the conversation. You guys can do whatever. I'm gonna go back to my room, Kokichi announced, already turning on his heel. I've got a wax effigy to vent to. Make sure you're in the courtyard by nighttime. Without caring to elaborate, Kokichi bounded off. It was difficult to keep himself from sprinting, and his footsteps did speed up when he was out of sight of his classmates, but at least he had a dignified exit. In truth, Kokichi was very tired and sore between the stress that came from their newfound situation, the throbbing ache in his wrists, and the lingering pain in his neck from nearly having the life choked out of him, was really starting to take a toll on him. A moment to be alone sounded lovely right now, and it was a moment he'd gladly take. Goodbye, Kokichi. I hope we'll meet again. Kokichi closed his eyes, letting out a barely calming breath. For someone who wasn't dead, Shuichi sure did like to haunt him. It was a clinic. Since thoughts were a little hard at the moment, he was trying to keep it simple. The place he and his friends were trapped in was a clinic, an abandoned clinic, but a clinic nonetheless. It was as if everyone had left in a hurry, leaving everything behind. That was fine. That meant he had materials to work with. like the water in the fridge he had tried to drink. It was tangy and stale. It tasted old, and he choked on it the minute it tried to enter his throat. Not because it was bad or anything, but simply because his body didn't remember how to swallow. The amount of time it took him to get accustomed to his body again was embarrassing. The amount of time it took him to even remember he was a functional human being was embarrassing. Getting out of that capsule had been hell in itself. His limbs would not collaborate with him. His entire body ached from being immobile for so long. His body was different. His hair was too long. There were scars on his arms he didn't remember receiving. He was far too skinny, making every slight touch feel like pin needles against his delicate skin. Overwhelming. That's what it was. He almost considered going back into the simulation and living there forever. He couldn't. His friends were counting on him. And the strangest part, there were heart monitors attached to every capsule. 15 of those heart monitors showed activity. The only one that didn't was the one he had come from. He tried not to think about what that meant. He really, really didn't want to think about it. Walking was hard, obviously. He felt like he was at war with his own body. If he tried to take a step forward, he would overestimate just how far that step had been and end up toppling over. Using the wall as support was difficult because, whoops, apparently he forgot how to process balance. So now he felt nauseous at all times, and also, maybe gravity didn't exist. Crawling wasn't an option because his hair was getting in the way, and why was it so long? Why wasn't it short, like it was supposed to be? Gonta, a boy, had long hair, and he was fine, so why did it feel so terrible? Was it because he wasn't? No, he didn't want to think about that. When he made it to the front lobby, he was completely surprised to find it trashed. All the windows were shattered, letting the suffocating, thick, dust-ridden air to roll into the building and enter his lungs. When he looked outside, he honestly wasn't sure what he was expecting, but a ruined city hadn't been very high on his expectations. It reminded him of what had been on the end of the death road of despair. At least the air wasn't toxic, only painful, like breathing in smoke. That was something he could spiral about later. If there was nothing for him outside, he'd have to stay inside. No help was coming his way. With that in mind, he closed his attention to the clinic alone. He'd spent a significant amount of time investigating the entire building, blacking out more often than he'd like, as he pushed the limits of his already weak body to the extremes. The only thing he found of note was in one of the patient rooms. There was old blood splattered all over the walls and floor, and every piece of medical equipment. The sight made him sick to his stomach, so he closed the door and pushed a chair in front of it in a feeble attempt to seal it off. He didn't want to know what had happened in there. Aside from that, he found nothing of value. Some rooms were interesting, like the handcuffs on the beds and clear signs of fights, but there wasn't anything he could use. The team must have packed up everything and ditched the project altogether. Why, though? Why would they leave behind something they obviously put an incredible amount of effort into? Monokuma even pointed out how impossible it was that they got their grubby, despair-ridden hands on the Neo-World program in the first place. It didn't make sense to abandon that kind of effort. After all that investigation and inner turmoil, he was sitting back in the room with all his friends. He was very relieved to finally give his poor body a rest, but he wasn't going to allow himself to fall asleep. He was afraid he wouldn't wake back up. The reason he left the simulation was to rescue his friends. However, sitting in front of the actual machine now, he had no idea where to start. This wasn't like Mew's virtual world. This looked infinitely more complicated, with many wires and screens and all kinds of things that he had no idea what to do with. If Mew were here, maybe she'd be able to figure it out. But she wasn't. Her body was in one of those green capsules and, no matter what the heart monitor said, she was dead. She had to be dead. He wasn't able to save her like he saved Kokichi. Koki. Right. He didn't know what was happening in there, and he knew that his friends were depending on him. At least, that is, if Kokichi decided to be a team player. He could very well be making things worse, simply out of spite for what he did to him. He shook his head to clear himself of the thought. The only thing that mattered right now was that he got his friends out of the simulation. Kokichi could do whatever he wanted, so long as no one else died. Well, he wasn't going to make any progress just sitting here. He'd have to be extremely cautious messing with it, but he had to at least try to free his friends. Trying was all he could do. It was the sound of doors slamming open in the distance that woke him up. He must have dozed off while trying to figure out how the program functioned. He had managed to pull up some alarmingly detailed vitals on all his friends, which was what led him to the report cards he used to be able to access on his monopad. The farthest he got was being able to access the monopad interface itself, which was a pretty big accomplishment in his eyes, considering he had zero idea what he was doing. His neck and shoulders ached as he sat up, wishing he could fall back into his blissful slumber. Sleeping forever sounded a lot more favorable than dealing with the people he could hear drawing ever closer to the People? He whispered, standing up from his chair and looking at the closed door behind him. He could definitely hear people in the building, voices shouting orders, and the sound of closed doors being kicked down. The panic that erupted within him was so overwhelming, he nearly cried out, but he had to figure out something fast. People in the building. Wasn't the outside a radioactive wasteland? How were there people here suddenly? No time to think. He didn't know who they were. The team? People just raiding the building for supplies? But he couldn't risk it being a malicious group. He wasn't sure what he could do against what sounded like a bunch of adults, considering that even taking a few steps forward took every ounce of energy he had left. But he wasn't going to do nothing. So, how could he defend himself? Blocking the door would slow him down, but that'd be near definitive proof that there were people inside. The element of surprise would give him a bit of advantage, but without a weapon, his weak stick arms were useless. With that in mind, there wasn't much around that he could use for self-defense. His best chance was the broom left in the corner by, he assumed, the team. Maybe he could hit someone with it? I'm doomed, was his only thought as he seized the broom and pressed himself against the wall by the doors. Those doors opened inwards, so he would be hidden for at least a few moments. That'd give him the chance to see if he could assess what these people intended to do, and if he should attack first. Fear like this wasn't something he had felt in a while. The last time he could think he was this afraid was when he was shot by Maki in whatever loop that was. This was different, though. He wasn't in the simulation, and by extension, the time loop. If he got himself hurt or killed, there were no second chances awaiting him. Don't get him wrong. It wasn't the thought of dying that scared him. It was the thought of not coming back. The doors opened suddenly, and he bit his tongue, trying his best to keep his breathing quiet as he watched a woman enter the room. It was hard to make out any details of her in the dark, but he did hear her inhale upon seeing all of the capsules. Makoto, she called over her shoulder, thankfully, not seeming to notice him hiding behind the open door.
In here.
Did you find them? Another person asked. Makoto, he assumed. Moments later, he heard that same person gasp. Damn it! It really isn't a fluke. The woman walked close to the nearest capsule, and he tensed. If she tried to hurt his friends, or even their bodies, that was Ryoma's capsule after all, then he was going to have to retaliate. Maybe he could try and attack her friend. He was still standing by the door, so if Shuichi was lucky, he could use the broom handle to hold against Makoto's throat. It may not be very effective against an adult, but
They're not dead,
the woman announced after a moment.
It looks like those people made some adjustments to the Neo World program.
Yeah, the heart monitors are definitely new, Makoto agreed, joining the woman's side to peer into the capsule. A moment passed. Kyoko? You see that?
I do.
The woman must be Kyoko. As her head began to turn, he quickly ducked fully behind the door, his fists aching with how hard he was clenching the broom. One of them is out, Makoto observed. From his hiding spot, he saw the man approach the capsule he had previously occupied. Has Byakuya called with any reports on the broadcast? The broadcast?
Nothing new to report, said the woman. They still only just moved past Kirumi Tojo's execution, which means it isn't being broadcasted live. It was pre-recorded.
But the killing game isn't over, if only one of them is awake, Makoto pointed out. And more importantly, where are they? Who left the simulation? Kirumi. These people had watched 4 of his friends die. Bitterness brewed deep in his chest, but something told him that these 2 hadn't been watching the killing game, which was apparently being broadcasted worldwide. For their enjoyment, they were here now, and they knew about the Neo World program. If they were part of the team, they'd know ahead of time that the killing game was pre-reported. So, if they weren't here to put him back in, then were they here to help? It felt too good to be true. The chances of people coming to save him and his classmates in just a mere day or 2 was improbable. They said they had seen Kirumi's execution, didn't they? That was over a week after the killing game had started. Maybe they really were members of the team.
They couldn't have gone far,
Kyoko stated, which was a little terrifying to hear. Her firm voice was matter-of-fact, the kind of person who'd be difficult to argue with.
Check all of the pods, and we can deduce who's missing. I'm going to check the program.
Oh, good idea. Oh, crap. Peeking out from behind the door again, he watched the 2 adults move to their respective tasks. Kyoko took to the computer screen he had been at, and Makoto began peering into all of the capsules one by one. He didn't care if they knew it was him who had escaped or not. What he did worry about was,
someone's been using the computer.
That. He didn't even think to hide the evidence of his work. Huh? Really? Makoto stopped what he was doing to join her side.
Recently, too. The seat is still warm,
Kyoko observed, which was yet another point he didn't take into account.
They must have been trying to get their classmates out when they heard us coming, and hid.
Hid? Makoto echoed.
Think about it. No matter who it was that escaped, they'd have no way of being able to tell whether we were a threat or not,
Kyoko pointed out.
They heard us breaking down those doors, and hid from us before we found our way here.
Because they didn't know if we were going to hurt them or not, Makoto murmured, sounding almost sad. Was he hearing this right? So they're probably still inside the building, which means it shouldn't be too hard to find them. The problem is, how are we going to convince them that we're here to help? I don't imagine telling them we're from the Future Foundation will work. Future Foundation? Where had he heard that recently? Someone mentioned it, but he couldn't remember who.
With our current situation, no, Kyoko concurred. You can convince them to come out. Though, if I'm correct, They might have been convinced already.
He froze. You think? Makoto didn't have to say it. He seemed to catch on to what she meant almost instantly.
It's a possibility,
was all Kyoko said on the matter.
I'm going to go out and call Byakuya. We're going to need people here as fast as possible.
Should we get you-know-who on the project? Makoto inquired, as he heard Kyoko's heeled footsteps moving towards the door.
We might, depending on its complexity.
Kyoko replied vaguely.
We don't know what that group did to it, and I want to avoid calling him out here, so long as we can help it. I'll be back in a bit.
Okay. Be careful, Kyoko.
There's nothing I cannot handle.
That was what she left Makoto with, and it was also when she closed the door he was hiding behind. It was only when he locked eyes with Makoto that he realized what just happened, and in that moment it was as if his brain shut down. Not a single thought came to mind other than, she totally did that on purpose. Oh, Makoto said after a moment. He blinked, glancing at where Kyoko had just disappeared to, before offering him a small smile. Hello there, Shuichi, right? What are you doing behind there with a broom? He glanced down at his makeshift weapon, which had turned out to be useless. He released his grip on it, letting it fall to the floor. Oh, was it self-defense? Makoto guessed. He nodded slightly, and Makoto hummed. I guess it's better than nothing, but it won't be necessary. My name is Makoto Naegi, and I'm a part of the Future Foundation. Me and my friends are here to stop the killing game you unfortunately took part in. I apologize that we didn't get here sooner. Well, if there was one thing he wasn't expecting, it was an apology. Do you want to sit down? Makoto suggested, pulling out the chair he had been using. The man's tone had a tinge of awkwardness to it, as if he wasn't quite sure what to do. He could understand that. He didn't know what to do either. Swallowing thickly, he forced his legs forward. These people were here to help his friends, and they would definitely have more luck than he would when it came to messing with the simulation. Or, to be more specific, the Neo World program. Hesitantly, he sat down. It felt nice to give his aching legs a rest. There you go, Makoto murmured quietly. You're probably pretty out of the loop, huh? His head swiveled to look at the man. What's that supposed to mean? Trying to speak was like rubbing his throat across sandpaper. His words came out hoarse, scratchy, and barely coherent. But that was the least of his concerns. Was that supposed to be a joke about his predicament? Was this guy really a part of the team that had trapped him there, and was just putting on some act to gain his trust and shove him back in when he let his guard down? That was just what Samugi had done. Listened to him talk until opportunity revealed itself, and she took that chance to kill him on the spot. I mean, you must be confused, Makoto explained hurriedly, probably having sensed his growing hostility, about everything that's happening. I was too when I finally escaped the killing game. I was in. Since you escaped yours prematurely, I can't imagine how confused you'd be. Oh. He felt a little silly for jumping to conclusions so quickly, but this guy was in a killing game? Was he one of the people who were in the killing game performed on Jabberwock Island? It sounds like talking is pretty hard, Makoto observed. Would you like some water? He shook his head. He tried that already, and it hardly worked in his favor. All right. Makoto didn't look like he knew what to do with that response. Well, Shuichi? You are Shuichi Saihara, right? Shuichi blinked. For some reason, that set a pang through his heart. Do I look that different? Makoto hesitated, glancing him up and down. Everyone looks at least a little different from how they are in the simulation. That's not what I asked. Anyway, Makoto said, in an obvious attempt to change the subject. We're going to be taking you and all of your friends back to headquarters. We have a hospital there that you can stay and recover in for however long it takes for us to find you all someplace to stay a little more permanently. Permanent? This is a pretty, sensitive case, Makoto explained, with a slight frown in the direction of the nearest capsule. We don't know why that group left this place, or even how they got their hands on the Neo World program. Since they did, they've proven that they're highly cunning and dangerous, so we have to prioritize moving all of you to a safe location before anything else. Don't worry, we'll have guards on this building faster than you can blink. That was the question, wasn't it? Why did the team abandon the project? Why did they choose him and his friends? Why would they do any of this, especially when it involved having to go through the trouble of stealing something so well guarded? Even Monokuma had brought up how difficult it was to steal it. So, why? How? What happened? I have to ask, Makoto spoke again, drawing him out of his thoughts. How did you escape? Shuichi grimaced. This one wasn't going to take too kindly to his throat. The hospital was surprisingly nice. It was empty, too. As soon as all of Makoto and Kyoko's Future Foundation friends arrived, it became kind of a problem when they told him he had to be transported to that hospital Makoto mentioned right away. Of course, he argued. He didn't want to be separated from his friends. He had to make sure they would be okay when they woke up. The thought of people like Kokichi and Maki waking up surrounded by all of these strange people was terrifying. He needed to be there to make sure they didn't come out swinging. That's what he tried to tell Makoto and Kyoko too, but they said that they had everything handled, to which he stubbornly replied that things were different now than what they had seen in the broadcast, and also he had left on a less than reassuring note, so they would want to see him when they woke up. Kyoko argued that his body was weak and he needed to be in a place where he could be medically treated. Shuichi pointed out that he had been fine for the past day, and he had handled worse in the simulation. Plus, he needed to explain who Future Foundation was, since they would trust him more than a bunch of strangers. Makoto compromised that if he went to the hospital, they would supply him with a phone and call frequently with updates. That was the best he was going to get. He begrudgingly accepted. Now, he was here, in a quiet room with only himself and the phone he was given. He was sure there was a nurse waiting just outside, prepared to leap into action should anything go awry. According to that nurse, 2 days had passed since he got here. He spent most of the time sleeping against his better judgment. There wasn't much to do in a hospital, apparently. Shuichi had never been to one before, not since he was very little anyway. But that was a long time ago, and he hardly remembered it. In movies, usually people get visitors, their friends, their family. Those people would come together to give the hospitalized their support, right? Offering comfort and gifts and good wishes. That didn't happen for Shuichi. The only people who came into his room were nurses and occasionally doctors, making sure he was still alive. He tried not to talk to them very much. He saved his voice for when Makoto called. It was lonely, in a sense. His friends from before the tragedy were probably long gone, and likely didn't even remember him if they were alive. All of his current friends were stuck in a computer simulation. His mom and dad, he tried calling their number, but he got no answer. The line went dead immediately. The same happened with his uncle and aunt, though the phone did ring for at least a little bit when he tried calling his uncle's office. He really hoped that that was proof his family truly existed and weren't just lies implanted in his head by the flashback lights. There was no one who cared about him enough to visit him. No one who could care enough to visit. They were either dead or trapped, and if his family was still alive, They certainly had no way of knowing if he was alive. Maybe, once everything was sorted out, he could look for them. Maybe they were still alive. On the morning of the third day, there was a knock at his door, giving him enough time to prepare himself before a woman walked in. She had tanner skin and wore the same uniform as Kyoko and Makoto had. "Hi!" she greeted him with a bright smile, stepping into the room.
I'm Aoi Asahina, part of the Future Foundation. Makoto told me everything that was happening, so I thought I'd check in.
Shuichi blinked at her. "Why?" he asked quietly. He wasn't against her being there or anything. He was just a little confused. It appeared she was confused as well.
Well, I finally got some time on my hands, so I decided to put it to good use. Everyone's super busy lately. We've got our hands a bit full.
Oh. Shuichi shrunk back slightly. "Sorry."
No, none of it is your fault.
Aoi was quick to reassure him.
Some of it the Future Foundation kind of brought upon itself. Besides, we're lucky that you escaped the New World program, right?
Ah, right. While he was here alone, he had a lot of time to think, and he had come to a few conclusions. The main thing he had been thinking about was what exactly triggered that broadcast. He knew that drew Future Foundation to the clinic. When he found out how long the broadcast had been running, it made a lot more sense. It was his departure from the program that started the broadcast, which had apparently been automatically edited to show only the engaging bits of the killing game. Apparently, AI was sort of powerful in the real world, not that he was very surprised. "I guess," he agreed. "I mean, why come see me? Surely you have better things to do."
Well, two things, admitted Aoi. One, I've been waiting to visit you since the moment you got here. I know how lonely things can get in a hospital, and especially since all of your friends have been asleep. Which brings me to point two. Kyoko asked me to deliver some news in person.
"News?" Shuichi echoed, worry piercing his heart like a thin knife. What news?"
Nothing bad.
Aoi was quick to reassure him.
In fact, it's actually really good. Kyoko managed to wake up some of your friends.
That snapped Shuichi to attention. "She did? All of my friends?"
Not all of them,
Aoi corrected him sheepishly.
Waking up people who died in the simulation is a lot harder, but surprisingly, the changes that the team made to the Neo World program work in our favor.
Waking up everyone who died? So, does that mean Kaede?
Anyway, everyone Kyoko woke up was just transferred here around an hour ago,
Aoi continued.
Almost everyone is asleep right now, so you'll have to wait to say hi, but we can go see them through the windows if you want.
Like, watch them sleep? Shuichi asked in faint alarm. Aoi huffed.
You don't have to make it sound so creepy. It's just to check up on them, you know?
Oh, yeah. Shuichi nodded, feeling his cheeks heat up in faint embarrassment. We can do that. Sorry.
You don't have to apologize. I'm just teasing,
Aoi assured him, though he figured she just felt bad.
Do you want to walk or sit in a wheelchair?
Walk, Shuichi's mouth answered automatically. He had been pathetic enough as it was. The thought of people staring at him in a wheelchair would only make him feel even worse. That was good enough for Aoi, though Shuichi presumed any medical professional would disagree with him. His legs felt like jello as he stood up, and he didn't miss the way Aoi stayed very close to him as they left the room he had been cooped up in for far too long. It kind of reminded him of how long he spent in his dormitory rooms, as the loops repeated over and over. Whoops, no, dangerous territory there. He was making a conscious effort to not think about the time loops. Shuichi had seen glimpses of them in the capsules, but the green lid made it harder to make out their features. Although he knew what was coming, it was a little jarring to see one of his friends lying motionless in a similar stark white room to his, especially when that person was Kaito, who was usually so loud and boisterous and had a presence that burned bright and unwaveringly. Now, though, Kaito looked different from the simulation. He was the same, and yet nothing alike. His hair was flatter, in a sense, falling around his neck rather than sticking up like it usually did. Most of his body was covered with a white blanket, but there was an IV drip connected to his arm, supplying him with the hydration and nutrients they'd all been lacking. Shuichi had never seen him look so still, so lifeless. It was unnerving, simply put. The others were all the same. Maki's hair was messily cut short, the sight of which effectively startled him. Himiko didn't change much, though he could see faint burn scars on her palms when he looked closely. K1B0 wasn't in a bed. He was near the wall. Two people Shuichi didn't recognize surrounding him. Aoi was told they were probably making sure he was still functional, since a doctor for people can't exactly help a robot, which he apparently was in real life too. Kokichi was the last one he saw. He looked so impossibly small in that hospital bed, heavy bags under his eyes, and unkempt hair framing hollow cheeks. To Shuichi, he looked as fragile as glass. "Koki," Shuichi murmured when he saw him. "How is he?"
He was pretty weak when he woke up.
Aoi admitted, her voice hesitant, as if she didn't know whether she should be telling him this.
Kyoko said not to take him lightly, though. He bit Kyoko when he woke up.
"What? He bit Kyoko?" Shuichi sputtered, nearly losing his footing in his shock. "Really?"
Aoi cracked a smile.
Yeah, she was pretty surprised, too.
Her expression faltered as she looked back at the sleeping boy.
He fought until he passed out.
"That's Koki. For you," Shuichi murmured fondly. That's about what he had been expecting to happen, and why he had been wanting to stay there when his friends woke up. "Is he okay?"
I'll be honest, none of us can say for sure,
Aoi admitted with a small sigh.
Whether you guys get better is up to you. We can't really help you if you don't want us to.
Ah, so we'll have to put in the work too. I guess that's how recovery works, but I'm really tired. Is Tsumugi here?" Shuichi asked Aoi, keeping his eyes firmly planted on Kokichi.
Tsumugi.
Aoi winced, and he saw her awkwardly avert her gaze.
About that.
"I know," Shuichi interrupted her, not to be rude or even intentionally. The words just came out. "I don't trust her. In fact, I'm really mad at her, and I don't want to talk to her. But is she here, too?"
You know?
Aoi looked surprised, but, much to his relief, she answered him.
She is here, but she's in a separate ward. We don't know what's going on with her, so it's better safe than sorry, right?
Maybe. It was the look on his face, but Aoi's features softened, and she placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder.
Everything's going to work out,
Aoi told him, and despite the gentleness of her voice, there was an underlying tone of certainty that instinctively put him at ease.
When I escaped the killing game, I was worried too. I didn't know what I'd do. Everything we went through was just starting to catch up with me, and it was a lot, even when the Future Foundation took us in. But my friends were there for me when things got too much to handle, and I promise, your friends will be there for you too. You've carried such a heavy burden, but you're not alone, you know? Talking and trusting your friends is the most important thing you can do right now. At least, that's what I think.
So, just close your eyes and trust that we'll take everything from here. That's what you're all about, right? Trust and truth and dumb things like that. Rely on My friends. Shuichi looked down at his hands. They were trembling. No matter what happens, or what I find outside of the Ark, I'll do my best to save all of you. All I hope is that, when this is all over, and everyone is finally safe, we can be friends. Right. Right. He promised. He made a promise to Kokichi, and he wasn't going to take it back. And all he had to do now was wait for his friends to wake up. Then maybe, finally, everything will end. He won't have to do this anymore. He'll be free.